Hi everyone. In this video, I'll talk about exchange rate regimes, which is discussed in Part A and Part E of Gerber Chapter 10. And I'll also talk about, for countries that control their exchange rate, how do they do that? When you look at certain exchange rates, like for example, euros per dollar, Great British pounds per dollar, you can see the pattern looks relatively random. When you look at the exchange rate between the Chinese yuan and the dollar, there's definitely long stretches that are highly unlikely the result of random market activity. So the yuan is an example of an exchange rate that is controlled or fixed, as we say. Every country has to choose an exchange rate system, and that's what we're going to talk about to start with. I'm going to use, and the Gerber chapter also uses, the IMF classification of exchange rate systems. Every year they put out a document and categorize exchange rate regimes based not just on what the country says that they're doing, but they base this classification on what the country is actually doing. There are other classifications, but this is probably the most widely used. Okay, as the Gerber chapter discusses in the introductory section, the exchange rates occur on a continuum between two opposite extremes, and those two opposite extremes are what we call floating exchange rates, where the value of the currency is completely determined by market forces, by supply and demand for the currency. Those are also called flexible exchange rates. Most large countries have flexible exchange rates. For example, the dollar, the yen, Canadian dollar, Great British pound. If a government attempts to manage or control the exchange rate in any way, we say the exchange rate is pegged or fixed. More than half of all countries use some type of pegged exchange rate or fixed exchange rate system. Some are what we call hard pegs, meaning the value stays for the most part fixed, and government fixes a value for the exchange rate and intervenes to maintain that value, versus so-called soft pegs or adjustable exchange rates, where the currency is largely pegged or fixed to a major currency, but can be readjusted from time to time within a certain range. So the government intervenes to influence the exchange rate, not to the degree that would be done under a fixed exchange rate regime. So you can see the majority of the countries fall into this in-between category. Some examples of managed or adjustable exchange rates are the Saudi Arabia rial is pegged to the US dollar. The Denmark currency, the krona, is pegged to the euro. There are currency unions in Africa that are pegged to the euro. And it's also possible to peg your currency to a basket of currencies instead of one specific currency. That's what China, Malaysia, and Singapore do. Whether you're talking about soft pegs or hard pegs, fixed or adjustable, when the government decides to peg their currency to the value, there has to be some anchor. It has to be pegged to something. So the three possible things it can be pegged to are another currency, like the dollar or the euro, or it can be pegged to a basket of currencies. There's always a little bit of a benefit in diversification. Or during the era of the gold standard, currencies were pegged according to a quantity of gold, a fixed weight of gold. So the Bretton Woods system from 1944 to 1971 was the most recent time frame that the United States and most of the countries in the world were on the gold standard, but the United States left in 71 and most other countries did as well. But that was a system of pegged or fixed exchange rates. A minor thing to note is that when you're talking about pegged exchange rates, instead of using the terms appreciate and depreciate, you say that a currency is devalued when a government decreases the value, or it's revalued when the government allows its nominal exchange rate to increase. Okay, let's look a little bit more in depth at each type of exchange rate regime. There are two types of fixed exchange rates, or hard pegs. The first one is no separate legal tender. That's when you adopt another country's currency, like Ecuador did in your podcast quiz. Ecuador is one of 7 countries that uses the US dollar. There are others as well. This is called dollarization, even though it doesn't always mean that the country uses the dollar. Some countries use the euro. So there are 3 countries not in the EU that have adopted the dollar. Happens on its own in high inflation countries. So you've probably, if you followed any of the news about Venezuela or Zimbabwe, dollars are often used there, although they're not always the official policy. The second type of hard peg is called a currency board. That is when the government fixes the domestic currency in terms of some anchor currency, which is usually dollars or euros. And the government has to maintain enough reserves of that anchor currency in order to guarantee that all holders of the domestic currency can at will convert into the reserve currency. And a currency board is voted on by the government. It's the law in places that adopt it. So Hong Kong currently has a currency board. Argentina famously had a currency board during the 1990s, in which the dollar was the anchor currency. Adopting a common currency like the euro is like an extreme form of a fixed exchange rate between countries that are on the common currency, because essentially your exchange rate is fixed 1-to-1. The exchange rate between France and Germany is 1-to-1. The euro is a free-floating currency, is categorized as a free-floating currency because it is determined by supply and demand. But for countries within the euro, it acts like a fixed exchange rate. There are actually 5 categories of soft pegs in the IMF classification. We're not going to go through the details of each one. That's beyond the scope of this lecture. But the conventional peg, the first one, is sort of the plain vanilla, most commonly used type of peg. The exchange rate essentially can fluctuate plus or minus 1% around a central band. So here's a nice depiction of that on the website of the Danish Central Bank, showing that the Danish krona is pegged to the euro at a rate of about 7.4 krona per euro. And so the blue line is showing the actual market rate that fluctuates a little bit according to supply and demand. That's actually an important thing I should mention. Even though governments with fixed exchange rates are able to control those exchange rates are still subject to the forces of supply and demand. Okay, so 2 examples. The Saudi Arabia currency is pegged to the US dollar. Another example. The Gerber textbook discusses briefly a crawling peg, which is these are soft pegs that are fixed but periodically adjusted in response to changes in a selected indicator, which is often the price level or inflation. And these are often adjusted so that the real exchange rate remains constant. So a couple examples of countries with crawling pegs right now. It's not a very big category, but here are a few countries. The third category says floating regimes, but there are actually two subcategories within this category. The first one, floating, means that the exchange rate is largely determined by market forces, so the forces of supply and demand, but the country sometimes intervenes. This is often called a dirty float or a managed float. So countries intervene whenever there are special circumstances, like, for example, large amounts of capital inflow or capital flight that are affecting the exchange rate. Countries that fall into this category are Brazil, Israel, Thailand, Turkey, and Switzerland. The second subcategory of the floating exchange rate regimes is free floating. These are exchange rates that are market determined, but still it's possible there is some intervention by the government, but that intervention is pretty rare and unusual, and it aims to address disorderly market conditions. This is also called a clean float sometimes. Currencies that fall into this category, some examples include the US dollar, the Great British Pound, and the euro. Countries that fix or peg their exchange rate do so by influencing supply and demand in foreign exchange markets. Foreign exchange markets are markets where currency is traded. The definition of a market in economics always refers to a group of buyers and sellers, not a physical location. So we have had a market for exchange rates where in the Mankiw textbook, where we modeled the real exchange rate. Here, we're just going to do a simple supply and demand model of the nominal exchange rate, where the demand curve slopes downward for the same reason any demand curve slopes downward. The lower the price, the more the market will buy. Supply curve slopes upward for the same reason they all slope upwards. At a higher price, sellers are willing to supply a higher number of units. And we'll use this to understand how countries are able to influence their exchange rates and why. There are two general reasons why countries seek to influence their exchange rates, which means essentially move them above or below what the value would be if it were determined by market equilibrium. So here, when we talk about the term undervalued and overvalued, that term can mean different things in different contexts. But here we're talking about relative to the equilibrium value that would be determined in the foreign exchange market. A foreign exchange intervention occurs when central banks engage in transactions to influence exchange rates. Let's first discuss undervalued exchange rates. Undervalued exchange rates, why would you want to keep your currency cheap or keep it from appreciating? Well, the primary reason is to boost your net exports, to boost exports. The Chinese currency has at times been considered undervalued due to government action in China. So from 1995 to 2005, the yuan was pegged to the dollar at a nominal exchange rate that undervalued the yuan and overvalued the dollar. We would be referring to this time frame on the exchange rate graph. So the rate there was, that peg was 8.28 yuan per dollar. Simply announcing a target can have no effect. But whenever the peg is higher than the equilibrium, there's going to be an excess supply of dollars. So I'm depicting this in the market for dollars. So if the dollar is overvalued, that means the price is too high. Always, when the price is too high, there's a surplus, there's an excess supply. So in order to reduce that excess supply, the Chinese government has to sort of vacuum up all those dollars. What they do is print yuan, their currency, and use it to buy dollars. So they buy dollars with newly created yuan continuously to maintain the peg. That essentially, as shown in my graphs here at the bottom, that in the market for dollars, that increases demand for dollars, maintains the peg. If you want to look at it from the perspective of the market for yuan, the market for the Chinese currency, it increases supply of yuan, therefore maintains the undervalued peg of the yuan. The dollar, what do they do with all those dollars that they accumulate when they buy dollars in foreign exchange markets? Some are used to buy U.S. assets. Some are held as foreign reserves. We've had this definition before. It means foreign currency held by central banks. An important aspect of this is that China's ability to do this is essentially unlimited because they can create as much yuan as they want. No other country in the world can tell them or control how much yuan they create. So their ability to do this is unlimited. That is in contrast to the other situation, an overvalued exchange rate. So most of the time, when you think about currency manipulation or foreign exchange intervention, I should say, people assume countries are typically keeping their exchange rate undervalued. But there's also sometimes some situations where countries are trying to keep their exchange rate overvalued relative to the market equilibrium. They would do that for a couple different reasons. A sharp depreciation can be very painful if your country has lots of debt denominated in a foreign currency. It can bring about a debt crisis because if your currency depreciates, it becomes very difficult. It becomes all the more difficult to pay back debts denominated in dollars, for example, if you're in Mexico and the peso depreciates, which is the example I have here in my notes. So before that tequila crisis that we've used as an example of capital flight, the Mexican peso was pegged to the US dollar at a nominal exchange rate that overvalued the peso and undervalued the dollar. So I've depicted that here in the market for dollars. The dollar is undervalued, so you can see the peg is below the equilibrium. So whenever the price is below equilibrium, when the price is too low, there's excess demand. So there's excess demand for dollars. We briefly discussed the political instability that led to capital flight, and we know already from our exchange rate model in Mankiw Chapter 19 that puts downward pressure on the real exchange rate. The same forces work on the nominal exchange rate as well. The real and the nominal exchange rate move together in the short run for floating currencies, at least. In order to maintain the peg, the Mexican authorities have to sell dollars and buy pesos. So in the market for dollars, that is an increase in the supply of dollars. In the market for pesos, it is an increase in demand that props up the value of the peso, keeps the value of the dollar low. Where do they get the dollars to go out and buy pesos? When I say they sell dollars, where do they get the dollars? They get those dollars from their foreign reserves. But the problem with using foreign reserves is that you only have a limited quantity. Mexico obviously can't print dollars. So, unlike a situation where a country's keeping their exchange rate undervalued, an overvalued exchange rate can only be defended temporarily, because if you run out of foreign reserves, if you run out of dollars, then the central bank loses the ability to maintain the peg. And that is what happened in Mexico in 1994 during that so-called tequila crisis. The government facing a currency crisis. So this is an example of a currency crisis. A government facing a currency crisis has two choices. They can let the value of the currency fall, give in to market forces, which sometimes they have no choice to do. They can also try to raise interest rates in the meantime to prevent the capital outflow and therefore prevent the depreciation. It's called defending a currency when a central bank attempts to use foreign reserves to buy the domestic currency and thereby maintain a fixed exchange rate when there's a large amount of downward pressure in foreign exchange markets. Here's a quote I got from a nice movie about the tequila crisis. I meant to put the reference, the source, and I apparently forgot. At any rate, when a government lacks the foreign reserves to defend an exchange rate peg, and they cannot or will not raise interest rates enough to attract foreign investment, then a currency crisis ensues, which is exactly what happened to Mexico. In Chapter 12, we will discuss currency crises further. In summary, for a country to keep a fixed exchange rate that is undervalued relative to the market equilibrium, the central bank has to sell the domestic currency. In the process of doing so, they accumulate foreign reserves because they sell domestic currency and buy foreign reserves. Revaluation occurs when they stop doing that. Sometimes the term currency manipulation is used in this context, but a more neutral term is competitive devaluation. That is when countries keep their exchange rate low in order to boost their export sector. And as we've already discussed, there is a very fine line between competitive devaluation and expansionary monetary policy, because expansionary monetary policy always has the effect of depreciating your currency. Okay, to keep the domestic currency overvalued, the central bank has to buy domestic currency, which increases the demand for the domestic currency and therefore keeps the exchange rate higher than it would be otherwise. They have to use their foreign reserves to do that, which for most countries is dollars or euros. I do have a graph showing foreign reserves. So dollars are by far the majority of foreign reserves. Euros, the next biggest, is nowhere near as dominant. When a country is defending its currency but runs out of reserves, devaluation occurs. Countries also can do devaluations not in a currency crisis situation too. Okay, devaluation can occur when the central bank runs out of reserves and it doesn't have the ability to prevent depreciation any longer. And all these international crises were associated with rapid currency devaluations because they were also associated with capital flight.